I've started to get into the tune, and I had no idea how long to leave it going for. Hey, hello, hello, hello. And firstly, a massive welcome and thank you, Ben Hutchinson. How are you this morning, Ben?
Things are good. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate the invite.
Hey, fantastic, mate. Listen, we were just gasbagging before we started the recording. You're some 3 hours behind us. You're not here in little old Aotearoa. Where are you currently located, Ben, and what's the time where you are?
It's 20 to 7. I'm in Brisbane, in Australia.
Fantastic, mate. Listen, your commitment to safety is far, far outweighs ours. There's no way in hell I would be getting up that early to interview with three idiots. So thank you
Well,
for
correction,
for
now it's
taking.
4 idiots.
Hey, can I remove myself from that equation?
I'll take your spot, mate.
Oh, Ben, well, this is embarrassing because we got you on as academic experts. I'm not quite sure what's about to happen
Well,
now.
yeah. I mean, I'm not an academic, but let's just roll with it.
Yeah, cool. Well, then Des has lied to us. But hey, that's typical of a lawyer, right? All they do is lawyers and snake oil salesmen. I'd love to get your thoughts on them, Ben. Go.
One is very good at billing you in 15-minute increments. Yeah.
Fantastic. Hey, Ben, again, just mate, thank you. Now, before we kind of get into it, I know, like I was just saying, I've done a huge amount of research into you and your papers and what you're trying to do in that space. I know the other two have done nothing. And I've got a ton of questions to ask you and get through, and I know you don't have a lot of time, but do you just kind of want to maybe for those, it'd be hard to believe that people don't know who you are, but do you just want to maybe give us a quick intro maybe as to who is Ben and what are you doing with yourself at the moment?
Yeah. So I think the main misconception about who I am, what I do. I'm an internal safety manager. I've pretty much been an internal safety manager my entire career. So I currently work as a national HSC manager in Australia. And then on the side, I've done a whole bunch of extra sort of curriculum. So I've just recently completed my PhD in safety science. I run a blog, and also I've recently, I think last year, started up a podcast. Um,
Whoa, whoa,
Whoa,
and,
whoa,
whoa,
whoa, whoa, whoa,
whoa,
whoa,
yeah, I
whoa,
mean,
whoa,
whoa.
there's territorial patches here, so I didn't wear my colours, but
whoa. Hang on. So somehow, Bez, you're supposed to do some due bloody diligence on this, mate. You've let another podcast host onto our show to promote his own podcast.
Yeah, well, his podcast actually delivers value, so I'm hoping a little bit of that rubs off on us.
Sorry, Ben. Carry on then, as you were.
no, that was kind of it. So I'm mostly just interested in organizational failure, organizational success. I used to start more with the failure side because I think, what this is interesting about. I'm a really strong supporter of learning from like normal work, how organizations normally don't fail, but you don't have many royal commissions when things don't catastrophically blow up. So like there's just by extension, you have a lot of really interesting insights and all the sort of way that people formed decisions around risk, the controls, how safe they felt themselves to be, vulnerability. It's just really hard to get that outside of really long, lengthy royal commissions. The unfortunate truth is Pike River in New Zealand is a good example of, it's a terrible example socially and emotionally, but it's a good example of the sorts of insights you can get around just the sort of very mundane things in organizations that made sense to people. So I'm really interested in sort of how to tap into those insights and apply that to safety.
Cool.
Well, fantastic. And outside of all of that, you're actually a normal human being, right? You've got a
Allegedly,
family.
yes.
Well, then on like what went wrong that got you excited about all that stuff you've just rattled on about? I mean, were you? I don't know. Did you walk into something? What was it? I mean, I know there's snakes and stuff in Australia. Did something bite you? A spider attack you? What made you kind of wake up one day and go, I'm really interested in this sort of stuff that I can't even recall what you said?
Oh, I mean, like with safety more broadly, I haven't met many people who wake up in the morning and said, "Yeah, I want to work in safety. Like that's my bread and butter." So like I fell into safety. I think like a lot of people, I enjoy the work. I like the field. I know some criticize whether it's profession, but anyway, The scientific stuff, the study of disasters, there's really not really an interesting sort of Marvel origin stories with that. Like, if I didn't work in safety when I was in human factors before that, I still would have looked at. It's probably a little bit harder with large scale disasters with certain fields. Like, I started actually in sports science. Like, I can't really study large scale disasters in sports science, but you could probably study large institutional cheating programs, like 50s, 60s, and later. The international cycling, like all the elite sports, there's institutional programs of drug use. So I probably still would have studied something similar at the institutional levels of failure. So there's no real interesting origin for why in safety. It's just sort of an area that I'm interested in. And others are interested in behavior. Like, and I'm not going to take shots at like behavioral approaches, but some people are interested in their units of measurement, their units of interest as individuals. Others are interested in institutional stuff. So I'm more interested in the institutional.
Oh, fantastic. And you mentioned you've just recently completed your PhD. That incited a round of applause from Des. To be fair, I'm like, do you not have anything better to do with your life? But that's okay. Like, what was your PhD on? Do you want to kind of elaborate a bit more on that, maybe?
Yeah. So I was looking at false assurance and false safety. So how is it that we build up these impressions of how safe we are, and then something catastrophically fails like the day after? And now, I didn't study any major disasters, but it was those major disasters that really triggered my interest. Was organizations on one day, you looked at a whole audit, you looked at their investigation reports, and they found things that were areas of concern or things that we knew that we need to get better at. And then, within the next day, something blows up and people are saying either we knew it all along and it was so obvious in hindsight, which is always the case. Everything's always obvious in hindsight. Or I think more interesting was it really blindsided the organization. And so I wanted to understand, how is it that our systems, which probably most of the time work for us, like they do generally help us coordinate goal-directed actions towards hazards in the field, to minimize risks over time, all those sort of things that we expect. But sometimes there's probably a niche area, a niche set of conditions where they're not really helping us achieve what we want them to achieve, and they can create unrealistic expectations about our level of risk mitigations. So that's what I studied, and I particularly focused on audits, the role that audits have in building up those false senses of safety.
And can you just re-explain it, what you studied to a 5-year-old?
Big things go boom. Hey, how did that happen?
Nice, thank you. I now understand exactly what you spent the last few years of your life studying.
Can I jump in? It's all right.
Oh, well, hey, listen, by all means, feel free to contribute to the show. You don't do much of that.
So this is fascinating, because I've done some very loose reading around this area, but the reading I've done was more around the concept of why businesses fail rather than necessarily why they have accidents. And I think there's clearly some synergy between those two things. So one of the examples that I read about was Kodak, the biggest business in the world, and suddenly they went to nothing. How does that happen? And a lot of the triggers for that is that the leadership don't really understand what's actually going on. They've lost touch. They've become quite disconnected. And even though they've got audits and saying we've got ISO this and ISO that, and they think their business is functioning correctly, a lot of the energy is misplaced and misdirected. Does that link with what you were looking at and what you were finding?
Yes. So I've actually covered a few of these studies on my site around broader organizational failures. So there's obviously the big financial ones.
Yeah.
Now, when you look at some of this research, you find that, to your point, a lot of the underpinning factors are pretty similar as far as it's really strong competitive pressures in the market, which really drive organizations to try and optimize. And then you have all the sort of sacrificing decisions that push over time and erode sort of our safety margins. It's the same with financial and accounting. Like I said, it was the same with some of the big financial disasters. Similar with some of there was that US Wells Fargo scheme, I think it was with the bank accounts, but that had perverse incentives, which was one of the critical factors where obviously you were incentivized to create more and more accounts that didn't exist, get the bonuses. I don't see that as often in some of the safety failures, but we have, to your point, we have things very similar. So we have obviously not even just cooking the books for safety performance, to whitewash our statistics so we have like a better TRIF or whatever.
Yeah.
But it's connected ultimately with financials. So we have to tender for those stats. So we need to find ways, not necessarily to make the figures up, which surely does happen, but we find really creative ways to put our best foot forward that's not accurate. So you can imagine like around the leadership team, in one sense, and this has been brought out by some of the recent prosecutions in some of the disaster investigations like in Australia and New Zealand, like the Port of Auckland case is a really good example around the expectations that the leadership team really should have had to get a good understanding around the hazards, the risk mitigations, risk controls versus the information they were actually getting. And yes, you find that through all of these disasters is the leadership team was certainly getting data. They were getting stuff from the field, but that sort of information didn't help them form a better impression around the safety margins, the things that they should be doing. And when I looked at audits specifically, we found really nothing enlightening as far as that. Like the audits were reporting on stuff, lots of stuff. And sometimes they were picking out really useful sort of findings, but it was immersed, it was covered, it was buried in so much other noise. And noise is an easy thing to say in hindsight. It's a bit more difficult for people in the moment to sort of differentiate because they're following the template. The template says, X, Y, Z, you need to do this, you need to check for this. But there is definitely a disparity between it. What we really should be measuring, what we should be monitoring, what we should be interested in. And don't get me wrong, like a lot of the stuff that we should be interested in, we can't necessarily quantify and measure. Like some of it we can, some of it we can't. And other stuff we have to use proxies and indirect measures. But yeah, there is a disconnect.
So Ben, I'd love to take this to a place that you probably didn't expect it to. Do you think, though, we often I talk about qualitative versus quantitative data, and you started to touch on that a little bit there, I think, in some of your stuff. I mean, and I don't want to make this all about AI because, Des is our leading expert in AI. But do you think things like AI can help us actually pull some of that qualitative data versus the quantitative data and maybe give us some better indication as to those things?
Yeah, I mean, I've used and I'm using the large language models for qualitative insights and for other stuff. But so the large language models tend to be pretty good at, and there's actually research that supports this. I wouldn't trust them for anything critical around qualitative coding, like to actually interpret human language. But if you give them a very specific task and you set up really good constraints, clear prompts, and you have checks and balances, they can do things like valence and sentiment analysis. So they can analyze language and they can show that. So here's an example, right? Let's say you want to analyze or you're interested in how people present some of our safety messaging or even any messaging from the business. Let's say it's in a toolbox or a pre-start or training. How is the leading hand or supervisor discussing that content? Is there cynicism? Is it very jocular, light, or is it very serious? Do they use certain keywords? We've been at that stage for years now where you can easily analyze that if you have it obviously recorded or if you have the text. And there's certain keywords you can pick up on. And given that these large language models literally have every dictionary, every thesaurus, they pretty much know every variation of a word, its meanings, the synonyms, and then homonyms, and everything of that nature. It's relatively trivial for them to actually analyze that sort of data. So you can get very, I won't even call it high level, you can get very curated analyses of data. Like you could do it with your investigations right now on Copilot, just with a few good prompts. You tell it what you're interested in. You want to understand cynicism, so you can tell it like, or emotionally sort of judgmental language, all those sort of things. Yes, AI has a lot of potential there. But it also obviously comes with its own caveats. It comes with its own limitations. And you can also get to the stage where you're just relying on it and you sort of lose the skill sets, which is a threat. And that's actually been found with surgeons in medicine, where in colonoscopies, where they're looking for polyps in the bowels. In fact, really specialized doctors that use AI, they tend to find more polyps. But if they don't have the technology anymore, their skills regress. So they're not as good at going big commando without the tech and finding them. So there is that risk there. Anyway, that was a huge tangent. To go back to your question.
Hey, listen, you've really helped me. I was really taken back by Des's comment that your podcast offers more value than ours, and you've really hit home as to why. I mean, I just rely on AI for all the content, for absolutely everything, and clearly my skill set has regressed so far backwards, and I really do value that. Now, before I hand over to Des for probably a really short, succinct question, I'm just going to ask you, if you were to think false assurance, right, and you were to kind of think it's a movie character, who would play said movie character, and would it have a catchphrase, and what would that catchphrase be, do you think?
Well, I definitely think Captain Hindsight from South Park would have to be the spokesperson for that. Now, hindsight isn't exactly the same thing, but it's so interrelated.
Really?
There's really no way to get away from this. That pretty much every single instance of false assurance, when it gets investigated, they don't often talk about false assurance, but they dance around it and they talk related sort of terms. When you look at a lot of the investigations, it's always framed with either outcome or hindsight bias, and that's a very human thing. But it's always clear after the fact, though. When the smoke clears, like it's easy to be able to piece together, all the breadcrumbs and say, look, it was so obvious. How couldn't they found it? It was right there. But then when you're in the moment, you've got so many competing demands. What's obvious after the fact isn't necessarily obvious before the fact. So that's its own interesting area of study. Is they talk about weak signals and all that sort of jazz, but even weak signals suggest that people can still pick up on, differentiate what's a signal and what's just noise, because that's very most of the time that's a very qualitative, experiential sort of insights. Like you need to be able to piece together, and then you get these after major accidents. There's always a whistleblower. Someone says, "Well, I've been telling you for 20 years there was an issue." And that's usually the case. Like usually there are people, and sometimes it is very, very valid, or quite often it's valid. Other times though, you just always have people always whistleblowing something. And eventually someone's going to get it right. Like when you have hundreds or thousands of these instances. Can I just go back quickly around the indicators though? Because I don't think I answered that question, but the Cliff's Notes version of that is there's a lot of potential for the AI with qualitative, but and there's been a lot of movements towards big data. But I think we also have to keep sight of little data, like that's getting back and that human connection with people, what they might call soft indicators. And that's possibly something that AI and the large language models can help with. Like they can definitely do parts of it, but they can't pick up on all the subtle interpersonal cues yet. Now, there is research actually showing that the video ones with video feeds, they probably can start to do some of that, but there's a whole element of things that only people can do, and you can only get through interpersonal relationships. So I would just preface people's giddiness of AI, which has a lot of value, but also you need to go out there and you need to build those relationships. You need to understand the indicators. And like Cynefin with Dave Snowden's work, they talk about human sensor networks, and there's done some really cool research around it. You could definitely automate some of that, but parts of it can't be replaced yet, and probably for the foreseeable future. And Chris, another one, there's this really cool advice, just because I don't know if we're going back to indicators. So David Oswald, a researcher, he proposed in one of his papers, it's on my site, for every quantitative indicator you have, you should have a qualitative one. So the to give it context and give it background and framing. So the quantitative give you the what, and then the qualitative really give you, the context below it. What does it actually mean, and why is it important? And I think it's really a really good heuristic for us to apply is if you present any numbers, you really should have some context around why it matters, if it matters.
Fantastic. So you did talk about indicators, and you've touched on it and whatnot, which has been really cool. And I really love the way you bring it back to, at the end of the day, we're people, right? And we need to be kind of interacting with people, and that's a skill set that I think we as professionals can bring, right? That ability there. What are some of the common signals that you've come across in your research where leaders kind of go, yeah, sweet, we're actually doing all right, and create that false sense? Have you identified any sort of trends or catches for people, for leaders, when actually those indicators are more just little blankets? I mean, have you got some specific examples?
Yes. I just don't know if it's that interesting or earth-shattering. Like injury measures are one of the key ones, but everyone's probably aware by now of like the work that the CSRA did in the US around the statistical invalidity of TRIFR. So what they're arguing is that TRIFR itself isn't statistically invalid. What they're saying is the way that we use it doesn't meet just the basics of the scientific method around statistical significance. And why I think that's important, besides the obvious reasons, is we're interpreting injury measures, and it doesn't have to be injury, it could be incidents, could be near misses. We're interpreting it and using it in ways that it just can't actually give us any or much confidence around. So let's say, so injuries and incidents, despite what it might seem like in some organizations, they talk about having their spike in incidents 1 month. They're actually statistically rare. Like on the grand scheme of things, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of worker hours, millions of worker hours, or even thousands. Having a handful of injuries out of thousands of worker hours is remarkably rare. Like almost the entire time we've had people working for that month, they've not had these incidents, or at least not reported them. So let's disconnect those two. So things that get reported aren't necessarily the things that are happening out there. We know that there's a huge underreporting, but if we put that aside for a second and just assume that it's relatively accurate for certain types of events, which it's not, but even with that assumption, it's still remarkably rare. And even if all the incidents were getting reported, it would still be remarkably rare anyway. So we're making decisions based on something which gives us no more predictability than rolling dice. And that's not even just a really loaded thing. Like that's what they actually demonstrated in those reports, is you may as well roll dice if you're predicting when the next injury happens than trying to get the predictive analytics out of our existing data, because we just don't have the power to do that. You could, in theory, do it, and they're talking about, you need like 10 years of data, over 3 trillion worker hours and things like that, or billions of hours up to trillions of hours. I think it's billions of hours. So most organizations don't have that liberty. They might have the time frame. But when you're looking about the time frame, if you need 10 years, like the organization today is remarkably different than it was years ago. So we're using data in ways that it really can't give us much confidence in. Now, I think some people have taken it too far when they say that there's really no value in it and we should just abandon it. I don't think that's substantiated by the evidence either. We have decades worth of research that does show there's value in incident and injury data, but it's probably not the way that we're using it most times. Like assessing our subbies when they come to site, and we're basing it on TRIFR and things like that, almost certainly has very little predictive utility.
Yeah.
So I do think that monthly reporting to leaders, and if they're making a lot of decisions based on injury and incident data, probably isn't really strongly connected to reality. And this is really common stuff now. This isn't really, what I'm trying to say. This isn't really pushing the boundaries of research. This is probably what most people really understand, but the presence of incidents doesn't give us much indication around the effectiveness of our critical systems or our proper systems. Doesn't say whether someone was exposed to a particular hazard. I was reading some prosecutions yesterday, and without labouring the details of this prosecution, the judge was like, it's actually irrespective that someone was injured, because they say the law is actually interested in whether someone was exposed to the risk, not whether they were injured or not. So it's inconsequential. And in fact, one of the prosecutions was someone that was exposed rather than injured. And I think it's kind of the same with our systems, is that we focus so much on things that are happening rather than the potentials. Do we have effective systems in place? How do we know? Do we know? And do we have the intel that's feeding in to give us that level of surety that our systems are working? And then, of course, and that's why I don't think many organizations do that very well. And you don't get a lot of that out of the research. Like, you get more of that out of, I think, the prosecutions. You get more of that out of the royal commissions and the big major disasters, like your Texas cities, Macondos, Pike Rivers, etc. They typically do have a focus on the risk systems, and that's typically where you get the insight around false safety. There was a site trailer sighting study that was done, like a Texas city, and because of this, they felt safe, blah, 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 even though the assessment was complete bluff. Like, it just wasn't calibrated to reality. Or Macondo, where they had analyses of the wells. I think it was to do with some sort of structural element of the wells, and they had to estimate how many of these structural elements you needed. And the model, being a model that wasn't reality, it was a representation of reality, but it was perceived as being very representative reality. So that's a good example of false safety, where you treat some sort of representation of the system, the measures, the metrics, the models, the risk assessments, we treat them as reality, even though they're not. And they really should just be prompts to help us make better decisions.
Some fantastic stuff there. I just want to kind of bring you back to something you touched on, and something we actually spoke about on one of our shows that don't add any value to anybody. But what I think we do have with our shows is some really good topics. The content behind them and the substance behind it that's rubbish, but the topics are really good. Interested in your thoughts. It's a little bit off topic from your PhD, and that I know, but we often find that, and you sort of start to touch on it around people are quite binary in their thinking a lot of the time. So, back in the day, Truffer was the be all and end all, right? Everybody was using it. Now all of a sudden we've swung to the other end, and it's terrible. Don't use it. And people tend to swing in extremes and become quite binary with their thinking, as opposed to somebody as insightful as yourself that's going, well, if you use it correctly, it can add value, and it's not as simple as saying we're all in or we're all out, and there's a middle ground. I mean, what are your thoughts in the world, in the safety profession, I think, and how binary sometimes our thinking is in relation to the next fad or the next thing?
My thinking is, because I do a lot of research in the broader psychology and the sociological fields too, I'm happy for someone to point out evidence to the contrary, but I haven't really found anything different in safety the way that we act. We're still just networks of people making safety is largely a social activity. We socially construct risk. I haven't seen anything fundamentally different yet about safety. Like, there's certainly things going to be different about the makeup of the safety practitioners compared to other domains. But when you look at, I was listening to a podcast around cults, and not even just like real freaky alien ones, which were part of it, but even more sort of mundane, weird, other sorts of cults. But it's just a very human thing to pick up on fads and these fringe ideas. So I don't think it's something inherent to safety. I think we're just more calibrated to the safety stuff, because that's sort of the fields that we work in. But certainly people do move from one sort of fad or extreme to the other. It's a very normal thing. In fact, James Reason, in one of his earlier books, he was really central in pushing the idea of latent sort of factors in the systems, like pushing just away from the frontline individuals. And he was so successful that he actually wrote in one of his books, maybe the pendulum has swung too far now. Maybe we're trying to push too far to very distant, latent, abstract factors. And sometimes some of the more obvious things were the critical factors. Maybe sometimes we do need to go back to just the frontline sort of sharp end focus. So I think that we do swing from one fad to the other, from one idea to the other. And I think it actually serves us pretty well at times. Like there's probably evolutionary reasons why we've done that. I wouldn't say that's a core reason, but certainly picking up on ideas that others are doing. Like we are motivated by social trends. There's research around social communities and how we would tend to align our thinking and our belief systems to the larger groups, because you don't want to get a spear through your back. So it's very useful for survival to align yourselves with the other dominant group norms. So I think it's the same with ideas. And sometimes, or often probably works in our favor, because it does actually getting people to think about and try new things. So there's this idea around, we talk about continuous improvement a lot, but there's this counter argument around discontinuous improvement. And I really like the idea of discontinuous improvement because it's really based around innovations, things that don't just come incrementally from, like the example is around, what was it? Ford. If they asked the common user what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse and carriage. So instead, they built a car. They didn't literally invent the car; they existed before that. But the sort of thinking is sometimes you do need to get outside of the same issues and things that have created the problems to begin with to create new ideas. So discontinuous thinking. So I think moving from one extreme to another can actually inject different thinking into the system. So let's say, and I don't know if this is a real example, I think it probably is. Let's say you're someone that started with behavioral safety. And I'm not going to put the slipper into behavioral safety because I think I'm not a fan, but we have a lot of evidence around behavioral approaches that it does work, at least short term. And I think it's pretty silly to completely abandon decades worth of insights and research around the effectiveness of behavioral approaches, but not my cup of tea. But let's say you were very die-in-the-wool behavioral, and then you're exposed to maybe more latent sort of organizational or upstream thinking. That gets you trying new things. You finding new leverage points in the organization to influence. Now, what's probably even more useful is, to no one's complete surprise, is instead of just going completely die-hard from individual to systems thinking, you try and find somewhere that helps incorporate both of those insights, and you expand what's called your adaptive toolbox. So I'm really a big supporter of this idea of the adaptive toolbox. It comes from, I think, Gerd Gigerenzer. He's talking more around cognitive abilities, but I think the sort of analogy works just more broadly. And if you're a systems nerd, there's this idea from cybernetics called requisite variety. Essentially what they're saying is, I'm going to butcher this, but essentially what they're saying is we have a whole lot of variability in our systems. It could be commercial pressures, it's different interpersonal relationships, knowledge, skills, tools, all that sort of stuff. The best way to actually get control around all the different variability is to have a more variable set of tools to respond to it. So what he says is variety destroys variety. If you have a whole lot of different things can influence our performance, you don't want to have less options to deal with it. You want more options to deal with it. And that's why I think having practitioners who are across more different ideas, it's easier then to be able to pick something that seems appropriate for the situation you're in. That's my kind of thinking. I like the idea. I try and apply as much as I can. So that's why I try to be fairly broadly read. And I can't say it always works. Like, it is very hard to sort of break your own internal sort of logics, your own biases. It's a very human thing, but I have my own biases too. But I think it gives you a better starting point to be able to find something that suits the context.
Oh, fantastic. Listen, I picked up on something, and I'm really feeling really bad here because Des is the man that organised this. Des is the one that actually listens to your podcast. He reads your papers. I've got to be honest. I don't know how to read. So, and
you also said 20 minutes ago you're going to throw to me for a question. So thanks for the heads up. That was awesome.
I've got some really serious questions here, though. Talking about fads. Are you a Crocs fan, like as in the shoe? Like, are you? Did you? I mean, I am. I'm a Crocs OG. Are you a Crocs fan? Do you wear Crocs or flops? What do you wear, mate?
No, I go to thongs.
Thongs, yeah, cool, okay. And for those that aren't in Australian, thongs aren't some kind of thing you put on your bum.
Aren't they?
Oh, yeah, that's just not real. And And the last question before heading over to Des, you talked about cups of tea. If we were to bump into you in a pub, what would Andy be shouting if it was his round? Because it's always Andy's round.
Look, I prefer cider.
Yeah.
If I'm trying to build rapport, then you have to go the beer just to look a bit more manly.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Fair enough.
Not really my thing.
Yeah. Okay. No, all good. Hey, Des,
have you got a question? Please.
I just might need another minute to think about it. No, you touched on some really good themes there that I like. The idea of data being something that needs to be quite broad and indicative only. I think a lot of people treat it as evidence, and I think there's an important distinction to be made there. And I know Greg Smith talks about being able to interrogate data. You need to have someone there to ask questions about the data, even if it's a quantitative. You still need to be able to interrogate it further, and the same with qualitative. And it's important to be able to dig down and actually get at evidence, or what I would call evidence rather than data. And I like the idea of someone, a practitioner, sort of curating their own toolbox of tools and applying it to the given situation. I think that's really important. But we've talked a lot about false assurances, but I'm pretty sure your PhD focused on auditing. So why auditing? Why did you pick on that one?
I'd like to give some really inspirational reason, but it was actually, I'm just a jilted prick, and I had a really bad experience from an audit once. So I was like,
hang on. Full disclosure here. Was once an auditor. Is this why you've got him on the show, Des? Was it Ben that gave you grief about your auditing career?
No, I haven't been an auditor. No,
oh, okay. Sorry,
didn't come from me. I've had similar traumatic experiences, so I related instantly to this.
Yeah, so that was the main reason. So my PhD was already on false assurance, and we were kind of working out what I'd actually be studying. And I had a really souring experience during an audit. And like, that's pretty common, like often you do. And look, this is one of those stories where, you learn to love along the way. Like it's really the friendships you made that made it important. That's what I would have said if I had a good experience from it, but I didn't. But anyway, it was like a standard audit. It was nothing really unusual about it. Like this sort of stuff happens everywhere, but whatever it was, I didn't connect with this person straight away. And look, I'm not blaming them. I'm probably just as much one of the critical factors in this. But we just didn't gel. Their perception around audits, around some of their findings. So they were on site for around 20 minutes, and then we were in the office for the rest of the time. And we had a fair bit of conflict around their findings, their interpretations, but they invoked the C word, the worst C word possible, culture.
No. See you next Tuesday.
Even word culture, mate. It is like the worst one. No, they use the word culture. So they said we believe like there's cultural issues. And I was like, you met maybe 4 people on site, and then you're in a room with another 5 or 6 people, or probably less actually, because that included 3 auditors. So let's say 6 people in total. So they met 7 people in total from a whole program of works in the state of Australia. And they made this conclusion around maybe cultural issues or whatever the wording was. It's that word, that specific phrase that really, really worked me up. Now, culture is a property of groups. You can't talk about culture if it's a context of one person or just very limited sort of groups. You have to. It's quite a strong, provocative statement. Like you have to have some really strong evidence to say something's cultural. Mm. Now, if they use the word climate, because I said I'm quite a picky, angry, vindictive prick. If they use the word climate, I probably would have just glossed over and like, yeah, whatever. But they said culture, and that's what really rolled me up. Was it got me thinking around how do auditors, with such little time on site, with such little insights effectively around the work, I know they have to do snapshots, but how do they convert such limited insights into such strongly worded, loaded concepts like culture? And how come they're taken so seriously? So I feel like at that time, I feel like the auditor's word had more weight than mine when I gave my side of the story. And actually, the relationship with my manager was good. Like, there was no issues there. And there was no real issue from the findings. Like, you sometimes get bad findings or things to improve. So it was really nothing that bad. I'm making more of it than it was. But it did get me wondering around just the amount of power that auditors have with their statements that seem disproportionate to the intel and the insights they actually collected on this day. So I thought that was a perfect basis for false assurance. What role do audits play in creating conditions of safety, sensitizing us to failure, but also creating false senses of safety? And to no one's surprise, like, audits seem, I won't say they're front and center, but they certainly do seem to play a role.
There's an old saying in customer service. Sorry, Brent, go ahead.
No, you go. I won't forget this question.
There's an old saying in customer service that if you treat a customer well, they'll tell 5 people. If you treat a customer poorly, they'll do a PhD on it and tell a whole podcast audience.
I could have probably saved you a whole bunch of pain, Ben. I've figured out the audit trick, why auditors do what they do. That's because they're in cahoots with snake oil salespeople. So what they do is they go in and they banter around big words like culture and the like, and then they slip their snake oil salesman mate a backhander and say, you should go in here and offer some kind of snake oil and sell them a whole cultural safety program. It works wonders for Andy. So listen, I could have saved you a whole world of pain. And you could have just put DR in front of your name to save you the effort.
I will actually add, though, I did my final study. I'm still trying to get it published, interviewing auditors. And I have to admit, it could just be the sample, like people who volunteered and who I reached out to were sort of more progressive in their thinking. But it was really good to see that the things that I raised to them, the things that we found in my prior research, most of them disagree with this. Most of them agree that those are real issues with auditing, and they felt strongly that it shouldn't be that case. So I have to admit, it was really positive to hear most of the auditors saying, yes, we know that's an issue. I don't agree with it. Unfortunately, it's the nature of the beast at the time, but we do want to try and improve it. So it was just really cool to get some of that confirmation bias, I guess, around some of these things we've observed in the research in my prior studies, auditors relate with. Like, they strongly relate with it. They know it's an issue. And they're kind of like, yeah, I'm sorry that happened to you. We need to do better. So it wasn't just pure denial, like, no, that was just a rogue auditor. Because that's one of my findings, this will be in this paper, is the audit profession, based on my sample, seems to be still coupled to blame. Like, they still frame a lot of structural issues as, I know this contradicts what I just said, but I'll explain the context. One of the findings was auditors still seem to relate system level, structural, institutional factors as individual issues. That's just a bad auditor. We know that they exist, and we're trying to do better with standards and ethics and whatnot. In fact, some of these issues were totally out of the auditor's control, like the schedule, the amount of time that the organization let him have on site, the amount of access they had to work and to key staff they had to talk to. A lot of these factors the auditor had very little input on, but it was interesting. The auditors often said that was a skill issue. If you're a really good auditor, you'd be able to get around that. So on one sense, yes, we had a lot of really progressive auditors that recognize there's a lot of issues, but to be fair, every sort of area, profession, whatever we want to call auditing, has its own issues, has its areas for improvement. So it's not just it's auditing, but auditors recognize that. But then, after giving me a whole spiel about mostly structural issues, they still related often to individual auditors. So I found that really interesting. And that's not because they're nasty, blame-ridden people. It's just that's just the way that I guess they've structured or they've conceptualized. That's their worldview around auditing performance. They still see it largely as an individual auditor, and it's tied heavily with codes of conduct, ethics, and competencies. Like, they see a good auditor as someone that can get through that. Whereas, in the broader safety science field, we would suggest they're more structural constraints. Unless you're addressing the structural constraints, you're fixing the environments that people are working within, you're pretty much always going to get the same output because people are still in the same situation.
So whether it's a good audit or a bad audit, whatever, like this, audits have pretty severe and obvious limitations in my view. Like it's really, they should, I don't understand why they've given so much weight when that's the case. And I don't know if that's something that you found or whether you disagree or not.
Yes, I agree with you entirely. Didn't unpack that one too much in my final study, but there's already quite a bit of research around sort of the power of auditing. So funnily enough, one of the key authors is Michael Power. He's published heaps around like the Audit Explosion, Audit Society. He was interested in why auditing, one, just totally exploded from the 80s onwards. And it wasn't a progressive thing. It was an exponential growth. Now, there's a lot of factors to it, but power, symbolism, demonstration, showing it that you care, there are all these factors as part of it. And it's no different with safety auditing. So it's a really easy way to demonstrate that you're doing something. It's an easy way to demonstrate that things are getting done, in theory. But of course, when you scratch the surface, it's not really giving you a demonstration that things are working effectively, though. And you mentioned Greg Smith's work, and he's actually, some of his work was really important with some of the framing of the questions around, when you think about why you do what you're doing if you're an auditor. Because what I did was I essentially unpacked, in my prior study, I unpacked what the auditors were looking at and what they were fixing, or what the audit sort of said was the gap, and then how was that gap getting fixed. So I put a lot of those sort of findings to the auditors and said, the audit seems to focus a lot on signatures on a document. What do you make of it? Why do we focus on signatures? What does it convey? What does it tell you? And interestingly, like auditors recognize, they think that maybe the signatures do take on a very strong symbolic purpose. Like they do sort of signal that someone's read the document, and in theory, someone understands the document. But when you probe them a little bit more, almost everyone recognized, but it doesn't really mean that, does it? Like you can easily read a document and sign it. Like as a project manager, you might have to sign 30 documents, easily more than 30 documents. That doesn't mean you've actually read and taken it and interpreted and understand what's in that document. You've just signed it, and it's a very symbolic thing. So I think that the Ray and Proven safety of work model is really interesting here. I think it does actually help explain not just auditing, but these safety activities that we do, these safety work has different goals, and that doesn't mean one's wrong. Having a symbolic goal or a demonstrative goal or resolving physical issues in the field, they're all important. Ultimately, actually addressing physical and psychosocial issues has to be surely the most important, but we do a whole bunch of stuff because that's just the way that we have to do it. So we do need to recognize that there's multiple competing goals, and false assurance, what we found in my research and supported by some of the other research, is it's when we sort of get that balance wrong and we don't understand that balance. So we're doing more of the symbolic stuff, or we're doing more of the demonstrative safety work. So we're doing more of the audits and the safety metrics to show that we're doing something, or to present to management to influence them, or to show them what measures of safety performance. When what we really should be doing is checking the effectiveness of our systems, engaging with people, understanding, do they understand what the issues are? Do they understand what the controls are? Do we understand if the controls work? All those sort of questions. I'm not sure if I actually answered your question, if I just waffled off, but I do think that audits are not central. I do think they're a big part of it. And I think we're doing them for a whole bunch of reasons that aren't helping us get better at safety. And some of them auditors seem to recognize, and then other ones. So here's an interesting insight then, actually. So my last two studies, the one I haven't published yet and the previous one, we identified cases where audits failed silently. So we call it failing silent. So the audits not only don't achieve their goals. So if the core goal of one of the audits, and again, they have multiple goals, but if the core goal is to check the effectiveness of our critical risk systems, that the controls are actually working and we're addressing those hazards and the risks, we found that there was a whole class of audits that weren't doing that. They just weren't or barely even touching the topic of those critical systems or the proper systems. And two, not only did they not look at them, but they provided a false sense of safety that systems were working. So they gave glowing reports with a whole bunch of green traffic lights and saying, it was a really great system based on international standards. And meanwhile, they were doing almost none of that. And there was massive gaps. We found that in some of the Royal Commissions and the disaster reports that, something blew up. Meanwhile, 6 months later, the audit was just glowing with feedback. And then 6 months later, they're saying that system was just totally broken. Of course, easy in hindsight, but audits have a role in that, just like probably everything does, inspections and investigations and all that sort of jazz.
Oh, fantastic. Now, Ben, I hate to cut you short, but I appreciate that three of us on this recording actually have to get off to a real job. And that's Des, yourself, and me. And we're rapidly running out of time. We might even have to do a series 2. Whoa, Andy, no need to get violent. We might need to do a session 2 because I think I've seen Andy feverishly taking notes and Des is nodding in agreement. But just kind of bringing this sort of part of the recording and yeah, maybe if you are keen, we can reach out and do a second half. But do you want to just give us a quick overview of your podcast and what value it's adding? Because clearly ours adds nothing. And if people want to actually get value with their time and their ears, what's your podcast all about and how do they find it?
Yeah, look, I don't know if it's delivering value. But anyway, it's called Safe As. It's on Spotify and Apple. So essentially what I do is I just take a single study or a single report. It could be a report about effective use of barriers and risk controls, or it could be whatever else. And then I pretty much waffle on about it for anywhere between 5 to 10 minutes. I don't do interviews. I'm antisocial. And this lets me stay on topic so I can cover a whole bunch of content in a very short sort of framework. And my whole thinking around it is I've set it up to reduce the overhead, so the time commitment. So these are my rules. Damn rules, they work pretty well. So I cover safety, performance, psychology, AI, a whole bunch of different topics, but mostly biased towards safety and accidents.
Well, no, clearly you add far better value. I mean, you waffle for what, between 5 and 10, we waffle for 45. So straight away, you're ahead of the curve on that one, in my opinion. But I guess one sort of takeaway from you that you'd like to leave those listening to this recording with before we get on with the rest of the day.
Yeah, look, I don't have something really succinct like 25 words or less, but I think based on the work of the auditing from broader work, like you see from Greg's work, from some of the like Pike River, some of the Royal Commissions, we really have to test the assumptions that we hold. So if we think that our critical controls are effective and they're critical to our business, we absolutely need them, then you need to go out there and understand if they're actually doing what we think they're doing. And that's something we find in the audits. My audit findings is they're frequently not doing what we think they're doing. Again, the point is we think they're testing the effectiveness of our critical systems. They're often not. So if you hold that assumption, you hold that belief, then you need to go out there and just check they're actually capable of doing that.
No, fantastic. Some great insights. And Ben, again, massive thank you. I know you got up real early for this, so really appreciate your time, your enthusiasm, and your waffle. It's been inspiring. So an absolute thank you from us to you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks very much. It's been awesome. Thanks, Ben.
All right, cheers.